Hi, I'm Chad with Move for Guitar. This lesson is from our series Music Theory for Guitar. In this lesson, I'm going to talk about harmonizing the half-whole diminished scale. First off, if you like the diagrams for everything in this series, including the diagrams for this lesson, you can download our free e-guide, Music Theory for Guitar. And this e-guide will be something that you can study and use as a reference for years to come. And like I said, it's free, so there's no reason not to just go download it. This is part 6.12 from our series, Music Theory for Guitar. If you'd like to go back and start at the beginning, you can click the link on the screen. So now that you know how to build the half-whole diminished scale, we're going to look at harmonizing it just like we did with the whole half diminished scale. And again, the half-whole diminished scale is root, flat 9, sharp 9, 3, flat 5, 5, 6, flat 7, and it's just a series of half steps and whole steps, symmetrical, so just repeats over and over. You can get a major triad out of this chord. Here's a root, 5, root, 3, 5, root. That would be a major chord right there, major triad. And we'll talk more about that in another lesson, but the most important way to harmonize this scale, which you're going to run across the most, is harmonizing it with seventh chords. So you can harmonize this and turn this, since it was in the key of G, into a G7. So if you look right here, I have my root, 5, flat 7, 3. That gives me a G7 chord, a dominant 7th chord, but I'm in the key of G, so that's a G7. Then you can harmonize that up the fretboard. Here is root position, first inversion, second inversion, third inversion. So that's the first thing to understand about harmonizing the half whole, is that you get dominant 7th chords, and this is why you can use it to solo over dominant 7th chords. The next thing I want to point out, which is an interesting thing about this scale, is if you took this dominant 7th chord, if you move this root up half a step to the flat 9, you would end up with a G7 flat 9. And that's really the sound that you usually create with the half-whole diminished scale. So anytime you see a 7 flat 9 on a chart, you're going to use the half-whole diminished scale, because that's usually where that chord comes from. Obviously you can get that from the altered scale, but the actual 7 flat 9 is a pretty distinct chord that is usually referring to coming out of the half-whole diminished scale. So anytime you see this chord on a chart, you would use the half-whole diminished scale to solo over it. Or if you saw a dominant 7th chord and wanted to solo over it, using the scale can really create the sound of the 7 flat 9. It has all the other altered notes as well, the flat 5, sharp 9, all except the sharp 5. But this scale is really known for using over 7 flat 9 chords. But that doesn't mean that's the only way you can do it. Anytime you see a 5 chord going back to the 1 chord, you can use this scale. That's the most typical way, and that would be in place of using the altered scale or like a Phrygian dominant scale. And then going back to this 7 flat 9 chord, you may notice something interesting, that this is the exact same shape as a diminished chord. So a G7 flat 9 without the root in it, which is what's on your screen and a very common way to play a 7 flat 9, is the exact same chord as a G sharp or A flat diminished 7th chord. So this is a G7 flat 9 chord with no root in it, so you end up with the intervals flat 9, 5, flat 7, 3. The root would be right here, and these intervals would compare back to this root. A G sharp diminished 7th chord is the exact same, except now the G sharp or A flat is your root, and these intervals are comparing back to the root, so you'd have flat 5 double, flat 7, flat 3 with this voicing. And because of that, because a 7 flat 9 is the same shape as a diminished 7th chord, it's now a symmetrical chord. If you have a 7 flat 9 chord without the root, which is a very common way to play this chord, you can now just use it as a symmetrical chord up your fretboard. So you would just have the different inversions, but the exact same shape, just like you do when you're taking a diminished 7th chord up the fretboard. The shape stays the exact same. And then again, you're just moving every interval in minor thirds, just like you do with the diminished 7th chord. So that's something really interesting about the way you can harmonize the half-whole diminished scale. And anytime you see that 7 flat 9 scale, it's typically coming out of the half-whole scale. That's where they've taken that chord from, and then you would use this scale to solo over it. And then anytime you take a 7 flat 9 chord voicing without the root in it, you can use it symmetrically like you do a diminished chord, a diminished 7th chord. So that's how to harmonize the half-whole diminished scale. Go ahead and move on to the next lesson where I'm going to dive even deeper into the diminished scales. And be sure to download the e-guide, all the diagrams are in there, and be sure to subscribe because we add at least one new lesson every day.